Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Doug, it's all yours.
All right, thanks so much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this week's TeleTown Hall, examining the long-term fiscal impact of COVID-19 on state and local governmental budgets. My name is Doug Kreiner, and I'm a professor of government at Cornell and the faculty director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us this morning as we explore bipartisan solutions to the multifaceted policy challenges presented by the global pandemic. I'd particularly like to thank our distinguished guests, Lieutenant Governor Ravitch and Senator Cassidy, for sharing their insights and their perspectives on these critical questions with us this morning. It's now my pleasure to introduce Representative Steve Israel, our Institute Director, to get us started.
Thank you so much, Professor Kreiner. Thanks for everything you do as the Faculty Director of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell. I have to tell you, I'm getting used to this chair. I've been sitting in this chair in front of this computer for about an hour. I was supposed to be on MSNBC, and just as I was about to go on, they started the hearings in the House of Representatives with Dr. Rick Bright from BARDA. So I sat patiently for about an hour and just never made it to camera. But I'm very glad that we can spend this time together. We have two extraordinary guests. United States Senator Bill Cassidy from Louisiana, a Republican, and the former Lieutenant Governor of the state of New York, Dick Ravitch. Before beginning, I want to acknowledge the many federal, state, and local officials who are participating today, and there are quite a few, so I'm going to go through briskly. Former United States Senator Mark Kirk, former Congressman Rick Lazio, former Congressman Bill Enyart from Illinois. Mark Kirk from Illinois, Rick Lazio from New York, Bill Enyart from Illinois, former Congresswoman Elizabeth Esty from Connecticut, former Georgia Congressman Jack Kingston. We're also joined by New York State Senator Jim Gorin and Todd Kaminsky, New York State Assemblyman Chuck Levine and Steve Stern. Steve is the parent of a Cornellian. The County Executive of Suffolk, Steve Ballone, the Nassau County Controller, Jack Schneerman, Nassau County Legislator Josh Lafazin, Tompkins County Legislator Martha Robertson, Suffolk County Legislator Kara Hahn, the Supervisor of the Town of North Hempstead, Judy Bosworth, the Clerk of the Town of North Hempstead, Wayne Wink, a Councilman from Binghamton, Joe Burns, the Mayor of Brookville, Dan Sirota, the Mayor of Sands Point, Ed Adler, Mayor Mike Koblenz from East Hills, Long Island, the Mayor of Flower Hill, Brian Harrington, former Mayor of Seacliff, Bruce Kennedy, former Supervisor of the Town of Hempstead, Laura Gillen, former Hempstead Town Councilwoman, Erin King, whose father I had the privilege of serving with in the House of Representatives, Peter King. Now, why are all of these local officials, state and local officials, joining us today? Because the issue of federal funding for state and local government will dominate this week and probably the next several weeks. And the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs is very pleased to be offering this format. For those of you who are new to the Institute provides a platform to deepen discourse and raise understanding. And our guests have included Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi and former White House Chief of Staff to President Trump, Reince Priebus. Last week, we had Israel's ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, explaining what was happening with respect to the Israeli elections. Molly Ball, the author of the new biography on Nancy Pelosi, joined us as well. If you are interested in being notified about these programs, and we have a rather robust schedule every week, you can visit our website at iopga.cornell.edu. That's iopga.cornell.edu. As I said, this is a very timely moment to have a conversation about federal and state aid to local governments. Tomorrow, the House of Representatives is scheduled to vote on a full package of $3 trillion. That includes about $1 trillion in direct aid to state and local governments. Now, some are saying that that is way too much. Others are saying that is way too little. From 16 years in Congress, I learned that solutions usually meet somewhere in the middle, which is why I've asked Senator Cassidy to join us this afternoon. He has proposed bipartisan legislation with Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey that would provide $500 billion in direct aid to state and local governments. So again, Speaker of the House Pelosi, is it about $1 trillion? Senator Kennedy is at about 500 billion. There are some in the Senate who say the total should be $0.00. His bill is called the State and Municipal Aid for Recovery and Transition Fund. Senator Cassidy is a physician. I served with him in the House for several years before his constituents, the state of Louisiana, gave him a promotion to the Senate. He created a public-private partnership to vaccinate 36,000 children in Baton Rouge against hepatitis B at no cost to schools. He was elected to the House in 2008. He was elected to the Senate in 2014. He serves on the Senate Finance Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Vets Committee. Now, here's the little glitch that we have, which will be rather easy to overcome. He's right in the middle of a vote on the Senate floor. Usually, senators get to go first, Dick Ravitch, but because the senator is voting, I'm going to introduce you, and then as soon as Senator Cassidy joins us, so you'll be able to hear from him directly. Dick Ravitch is, in my view, has a deeper grasp of the condition of state and local governments than anybody I know, and I've known him for a long time. He was a key advisor to me when I was in Congress on that issue. He served us as the former lieutenant governor of the state of New York. In 1975, he was appointed by Governor Hugh Carey to chair the State Urban Development Corporation. He was instrumental as part of a small group in resolving New York's debt crisis in the mid-70s. In 1979, he became chairman of the Metropolitan Transportation Authority. And among his many activities now, the one I'm proudest about is that he is the chairman of the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. I've asked Dick to present to us an overview of the current fiscal condition of state and local governments. And Dick, thank you so much for being with us, and you have the floor.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm delighted to defer whenever the senator is able to come on the call, the Senate business being even more important than our conference. Steve, you have always managed to make sure that people who want to get educated about every political issue that the country faces. Let me try in a few minutes to describe the problem. The problem is we do not know how long the economy is going to remain very quiescent. We do know that from a public point of view, the major impact of this economic decline, of the growth in unemployment, of the separation that people are engaged in. We do know one thing for sure, that state and city revenues are declining very, very rapidly. The estimate that I find most credible, and they're only guesses, is $650 billion of shortfall over the next 2.5 years for the states and cities of the United States. The issue arises from the following. To the cities, the primary revenue of cities in this country is the property tax. Well, property values are going down. If people don't pay rent, and stores and restaurants, and in many cases, residential tenants are not paying rent. So property values are declining, and people, I don't know what I'm seeing on the screen.
I think Senator Cassidy's office may just be trying to connect, but go ahead, Dick. When he's on, I may just interrupt you apologetically, let him speak, and then come back to you. Property taxes are the chief revenue that municipalities have around the country. Property values are going down. If people don't pay rent, owners of property are going to seek reductions in assessed value. It is impossible to predict
the extent of that. It's impossible to predict the precise response that cities will have to these requests to reduce assessed value. And there will be a lot of litigation flowing from it because cities will resist on inappropriate reductions in assessed value. Second of all, cities receive a significant percentage of their budget from the states in which they're located. New York City, for example, gets about 9% of its budget from the state of New York. The state of New York has already indicated that in the current fiscal year, they will have a $15 billion deficit in their revenue collection. In other words, they'll get 15 billion less than what they calculated when they approved their budget in March. But these are all guesses because nobody can be quite sure any more than people know how the debate between the president and Dr. Fauci is going to come out either. And therefore, we don't know when the economies will turn around. The third element of this, of course, is sales taxes. Well, if you can't go to a store and buy something, and you can only buy it on the internet, and not all internet purchasing facilities make adequate provision for the payment of sales taxes. So we have all the sources of income that cities have, and to a large extent, states as well, plus the income tax, obviously. Now most cities don't have income taxes. New York does. Every state has, to the best of my knowledge, has an income tax. The Speaker's bill attempts to assure people that there will be enough cash available to enable a commitment to the public that essentials, police, fire, sanitation, healthcare services will remain available to the public. That is the motive and the purpose besides Speaker Pelosi's bill. And her estimate, nobody says the $1 billion for states and cities is a precise prediction, but it is an effort to make sure that there is enough money available so that the essential services that our society and our citizenry depend on will continue. Number two, there have been legitimate questions raised about the following. Is there going to be any control mechanism? Is there any way of assuring that the money will not be used in a profligate manner by politicians who are trying to get reelected? In New York, when New York City faced bankruptcy in 1975, we created a control board. The control board had power over the city's budget. I'm not suggesting the federal government should create a control board, but I think before members of Congress vote for a massive amount of aid of the kind that the Speaker's talking about, that they be entitled to know that there is a mechanism that provides some assurance that the money will not be spent profligately. Second of all, there is the issue as to whether the money can be used to compensate states that have not adequately budgeted in the past, like the state of Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, I hate to add Louisiana, Kentucky, that have unfunded or underfunded pension systems. They should not be permitted to use the money out of this appropriation, whatever its size, to compensate for past for past delinquencies. And third of all, in my opinion, there is a real concern about a profligate number of lawsuits of people trying to take advantage of employers and bringing lawsuits. And I think that there should be some protection, some indemnification, some degree of protection accorded to avoid the frivolous and irresponsible kind of lawsuit on matters where individual business owners are not really responsible for the harm that their employees received. I think all of this can be worked out and should be worked out. I think reducing the size of the total amount of money available is a mistake. Because if it isn't needed, if the need is not demonstrated, the money will not be taken down. This is money to be used solely and exclusively for the purpose of compensating for revenue shortfalls. And the business community should be knocking down the doors of the Congress of the United States to get this passed. And as to the issue of the inflationary impact of appropriations of this size, yes, it is inflationary. So was the $1 billion tax cut that the Congress passed 2 years ago. And Republicans didn't seem worried about the impact on inflation then. That is a consequence that we have to live with because the alternative is so much worse. Last of all, let me address the issue of the very generous program that Chairman Powell initiated at the Fed with the support of the Treasury Department. Borrowing is an answer for a short-term problem. We have no idea the length of time that this revenue underfunding will take place. Therefore, any loans cannot be presumed to be able to be repaid in the short term. Just as, for example, nobody suggested in the case of Puerto Rico, when it fell upon hard times a couple of years ago, that loans were the answer. There was a control mechanism. There was a reduction in existing debt as part of the solution to assure continuity of essential government services. Well, I think that the presumption here is that what cities and states are prepared to spend during this period of god-awful austerity, of diminished and unknown revenues, that what they're prepared to spend will be very minimal and compared to what they would if our economy was expanding and there was a level of optimism and presumption of growth prevailing in our culture and our society. And therefore, I think borrowing has some limited value, but I don't think saddling cities and states with vast amounts of debt to be repaid at some time in the future, which in and of itself is highly uncertain, is an appropriate solution.
Well, Dick, timing is everything. As you began to wind down, Senator Cassidy joined the call, having left votes on the floor of the Senate. Senator, Thank you so much for being with us. Dick Ravitch, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York and one of the brightest people I know on state and local finances, just gave us a briefing on the condition of state and local governments. He estimated, although as you know, no way of being certain, about a $650 billion shortfall to state and local governments over the next 2.5 years as a result of COVID. Before you got on, Senator, I was preaching about your talents and your strengths. I was talking about your bipartisanship on this matter, having proposed bipartisan legislation with Senator Menendez. We have quite a few state and local officials on this call. And why don't I just, as I used to say, yield to the gentleman from Louisiana to talk about your bill and its prospects. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Appreciate it, and appreciate for the forum. So I go to vote and I walk through the area that you pass and see the headlines. Okay, so here, Fed chair warns of lasting harm without new aid. And again, markets tumble, the Wall Street Journal version of that. And then you go to USA Today, states facing deep deficits. And then another Washington Post, steep downturn without more aid, Fed warns. So everything that the folks on this call understand, which is if we put billions into the small businesses to keep them able to employ folks, but we don't provide cities and states with the money to provide the essential services. To put it most graphically, if you have to lay off your sanitation worker, no one will go to the restaurant unless it is physically safe to go, including both fire protection and police, and if the garbage is not picked up with the rats removed. If the garbage builds up and the rats are there, people will not walk in. It is intuitive to us. That said, what are the process? So you would think that our bill would be a no-brainer. Boom, let's just do it. It's not quite so easy, and Steve will smile because, of course, it's never easy on Capitol Hill. When our founding fathers said make it difficult, they did a really good job. I suppose Lieutenant Governor Ravitch spoke of the $650 billion. Menendez and I picked $500 billion. Moody's is predicting a $300 billion shortfall over the next year and a half, 27 months. And then we added on some more for cities. My state, Moody's projects will lose 46% of its tax revenue. If you look at a city like New Orleans, this time of year it's gorgeous in New Orleans. We should have had the Jazz and Heritage Festival, which would have brought in maybe 1 million tourists, with hotel bed fees, landing fees, sales tax revenue, etc., and it's all gone. So the question is, how do New Orleans or the surrounding parishes pay for basic services? So we throw, $200 billion seemed like a kind of an evenly spread thing. Now, there's been some who've complained about the CARES Act. Some states have received money far more than they needed because they've not been impacted. We heard that. So we do have a floor. Every state receives at least a certain amount of money, but then we put it in 3 tranches. The 3 tranches would be that the first would be based on population. That money could go out tomorrow. Boom. The next third will be the degree to which your state has been affected in terms of health. Lots of cases, lots of hospitalization. The next third is apportioned along those lines. And then the next third would be based upon the economic impact. Now, the health tranche would be determined at the end of June, because we see that in some places, cases are still going up, others it is waning. So by the end of June, we thought we would have that. The last tranche would go out at the end of the calendar year. By that time, everybody's had a sense of the impact this has had upon their revenue streams. Now, some states, frankly, are not impacted that much. South Dakota is actually making more money now because they never closed down their economy. They're sparsely populated. They're actually doing better. Whereas New York, New Jersey, Michigan, Louisiana have been terribly impacted. But Asa Hutchinson, the governor of Arkansas, when asked about this in a forum, said, my state could probably get through, but I have to recognize that ultimately, Arkansas will not do as well as it could unless New York recovers. You can't have New York City shut down and expect Arkansas to fully come back. So again, I think there has to be that sort of we're all in it together perspective. a kind of, if you've ever done Sim City, you recognize that if one part of your society does poorly, ultimately all parts do less well. There is political pushback. We have spent $2 trillion. And some folks are saying, stop. Either don't spend another dime, period, end of story. We've got to worry about debt and deficit. Or they're saying, let's look at least to see how we've already spent the money before we spend more. And by the way, we gave states a lot of money already, $150 billion. Why don't we take that first $150 billion, give them more flexibility how to spend, and then see if more money is needed. I agree with the need for oversight. We can't just assume the money has been spent correctly and then go forth. We also include that $150 billion that's already been put out there in the SMART Act to give the flexibility that those would wish, but then point out that if you just take everything we put out there already, which is for Medicaid, for the coronavirus response in particular, for some other pots, that it's roughly $270 billion. That is not the $500 billion that we project, or the over $600 billion that Lieutenant Governor Ravitch supported. So we think that if you look over the next 27 months, the $150 billion will not be adequate. I'll mention one more thing. The House just passed a package, which is, I think, $1 trillion. Now, the House package will not pass a Republican Senate. And we can argue its merits or not, but it just won't pass. And I think that imagine we'll get $1 trillion, not going to happen. But we're hoping that we will get $500 billion. And I was asked by a reporter yesterday, I'm a physician, so I use sometimes medical terms. She said, what do you think the likelihood of gaining Republican support in the Senate for your bill? And I say it's gestating. Just like a baby in the mother's womb is gestating, coming closer to birth. Every time there's a state like mine, which just reported $1 billion shortfall for this fiscal year coming up, it gestates a little bit more. And every time the epidemic then hits another state with collapse of revenue, it gestates a little bit more. So I don't know if I can tell you it's going to pass tomorrow, but I think we will have support from local and state officials of both parties to the degree that sometime this summer it can pass. And so, Steve, that's kind of the analysis I give at this point.
Thank you so much, Senator. And again, although people may have differences and arguments with elements of your bill, it truly is bipartisan. And I was saying before you got on that my experience in Washington is when you have a bunch of members saying it should be zero and a bunch of members saying it's going to be it needs to be $1 trillion, you're going to end up somewhere in between. Your bill is somewhere in between.
Right there.
Yeah, right there. Right there. Let's do this. I know we have questions and we only have about 20 minutes before we have, well, about half hour before we have to break. I'm going to ask Professor Doug Kreiner, the faculty director of the Cornell Institute, to ask the first question. But before that, Natalie Ryan is going to give instructions for people to get in the queue to ask their questions of Senator Cassidy and Mr. Ravitch. Natalie, do you want to give instructions, please?
Absolutely. So all of our attendees, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a raised hand function right there in the middle. If you go ahead and click that, I will get the notification that you have a question for either Mr. Ravitch or for Senator Cassidy, and we can call on you during the Q&A.
So please do that to all of our participants. And Professor Kreiner, why don't you lead us off?
Thanks so much. Senator Cassidy, thank you for the really thorough overview of the funding mechanisms, so the allocation mechanisms within your proposal. Distributive politics are always tough. And so just to quickly recap for anyone who missed it, a third of the money, or one tranche of money, is allocated based on population. Another tranche is allocated based on revenue loss, and another tranche allocated on infection rates. I just wanted to ask, has any of these mechanisms produced more political pushback with your colleagues than others? And how have you and Senator Menendez tried to thread the needle on a really thorny political problem?
You know, I would like to tell you that we've gotten to the basics of what we're talking about. Right now, it's just a question of whether or not we're going to spend more money. I think that, and I'll just give you an insight into my conversations, somewhere across between hell no and I'll think about it, with some saying I'm with you. Some have already realized their states are being incredibly impacted. They're with me. Others who have states that have been incredibly impacted are actually hell no. So we've got some work to do. I continually bring up the 1/3, 1/3, 1/3 as a way that I think is fair, recognizing that politics dictates that you have to have a certain amount for every state no matter what. But I'm not sure people are yet hearing that. They need to hear from their state and local officials first. We're in a fix. We can't get out of it. If we collapse, so does our small business community. And then they'll start hearing 1/3, 1/3, 1/3.
All right, Natalie, let's open it up to questions.
Sure. So our first question comes from Mr. Burt Brodsky. Mr. Brodsky, if you could go ahead and unmute your microphone, please, you can go ahead and ask a question.
Senator, how are you today?
I'm good. How are you?
Good seeing you again. I'm fine.
Yes,
thank
sir.
you. So we're talking about dollars and
Bert, you there?
municipalities have an agreement where they're the most favored nation for pricing. Because you often see or hear about government overpaying for things. Why isn't it a flat rule that the federal government and the state and municipalities can't pay more than the lowest price those vendors sell to other people?
Now, Bert, you're far beyond that which we are considering in this bill. I could imagine a couple of pushbacks on that. For example, I've been told that cast iron might be cheaper to do in terms of sewer pipes, but that PVC has a much longer life, and so therefore the lifetime cost is less for less for PVC. But it really depends at what point you would draw it down. I may have that wrong, but in concept, you know what I'm saying. So as a federal politician, I would prefer to give that to the states to make those rules as opposed to dictating from Washington. But what you're saying makes sense to me, and I would agree with it in principle were I the state politician.
Thank you, Bert. For those of you who don't know, Bert has a friendly relationship with the senator. He is the head of the Alzheimer's Foundation of America and devotes much of his work to helping caregivers and supporting investments in Alzheimer's research. So thank you very much, Bert, for the question. Natalie, let's take the next.
Of course. Before I call on the next person, I just want to remind you at the bottom of your screen, you have the raise hand function. If you go ahead and click on that, that's how you can ask a question today. So our next question comes from a Patrick Ryan. Patrick, if you go ahead and unmute yourself, you'll be able to ask your question.
Hi, good afternoon, Senator and Lieutenant Governor. This is Pat Ryan. I'm the county executive in Ulster County in upstate New York. Really appreciate your remarks. As you are,
Patrick, and a veteran.
Yes, sir. That's right. I wanted to just build on the discussion in terms of, and help you understand, as I think you know, the need, particularly in New York State, county governments have served on the front lines, and County Executive Balone on the line knows this as well, of COVID response, standing up emergency operations centers, staffing up, running testing operations, so on and so forth. And I understand the hesitance to determine direct funding below the state level, but I do think it's critical that at the federal level you recognize that everybody at every layer is under pressure, and the temptation to sort of hold that at the state level is a concern, to be direct and blunt, and would love to get your thoughts on that, because we are under a tremendous amount of pressure here as well at the county level, as I know others in the state are. Thank you.
Hey Pat, I'm laughing. You know, you saw that movie recently about a bad marriage falling apart. I think that's NGO, and I think that's the National Governors Association, the National Association of Counties. So anyway, suffice it to say that we have addressed this in excruciating detail, and it's been one of those things. We have one or two issues left to work out, but that was like the first issue. If we did not work out, we could not go further. There will be dollars going directly to cities and counties. And I know more about New York politics now than I ever thought I would want to know, but it's pretty contentious, I gather. But we have definitely addressed that, and there will be money coming directly to counties.
Senator, before we go to the next question, let me just ask exactly where does the bill stand? You've been working with Senator Menendez. What's the timetable over the next several weeks and months?
So we have, Steve, we also work with the House side. So there are both Democrats and Republicans who will introduce on the House side. And even beyond the people introducing, we're building a coalition that I think will be helpful. But we do have one or two more kind of policy issues that have to be resolved before we can do. We're hoping to enter, we were thinking of today, but it'll probably be like Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of next week. On the other hand, delay should not be seen as anything negative. Delay should be seen as something that's really working through issues that otherwise would be quicksand traps. And so I think it will be stronger for this kind of one or two more day delay.
Great, thank you. Natalie, do we have another question? And obviously, Dick, if you want to add your comments and your opinions, we'd love to hear from you as well. Natalie, next question.
Of course. So our next question comes from former Congresswoman Elizabeth. So Congresswoman, if you could go ahead and unmute yourself, you'll be able to speak.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks to the folks. Nice to see you, Steve. Nice to see you, Senator Cassidy. And I'm really encouraged by the thoughtfulness of the proposal. I think that's exactly the, one third is not perfect, but it is an acknowledgement that states are differently situated and you have to put together a political coalition. To that end, one of the issues that, having been on T&I for 6 years, I've been seeing how incredibly important broadband is. It's something we've tried to work on as part of essential infrastructure. And I'm wondering if there are any conversations going on, given that it is essential for rural as well as urban areas. It really is a lifeline, and we've got to do it for education. Clearly, you can't have education, whether it's primary, secondary, or post-secondary, without having robust broadband. So just wondering, Senator, if there are discussions going on that subject to really rethink our commitment, given the reality that is now so much is happening over that. Thanks very much.
Yes, I totally agree with you on the need for broadband. That's not part of this proposal in particular, but there's something called a problem solvers caucus, as you know, on the House side, 25 Democrats, 25 Republicans, and we as senators will join as part of that coalition, our caucus, if you will. And it's amazing, across the nation, you hear that discussion. We need rural broadband. So I'm with you on that. But as you know, you have to kind of sequence your battles. And so I've been asked to be on some really good stuff lately. And I've had to say, okay, I will get there. But right now, I have to get through this. So if you'd like to collaborate, however we'd push that organically from to express the need, but within Congress to hopefully act upon it, I am so open to that. But at this point, that's not part of this proposal. And again, I'm just sequencing my battles.
Senator, you mentioned the problem solvers. We featured them in one of our conference calls just several weeks ago. We had Congressman Josh Gottheimer and Congressman Tom Reed on talking about their bipartisan approach to COVID issues. So thank you for mentioning them. Dick, I wonder if I could just go to you for a moment on the issue of infrastructure. Do you have any thoughts about how infrastructure does play into a COVID-19 recovery, economic recovery?
Well, it's relevant for two particular reasons. One, the construction industry is a major employer historically, and if there's no construction going on, particularly no public construction, it will have a negative impact on employment and therefore on revenues that cities and states are collecting. Second of all, you already have an infrastructure in the United States that has been tragically underfunded. Just take the subway system in New York, which moved 3 million people a day, as a prime example. And the failure of the Congress to adequately fund essential infrastructure has been, in my judgment, a tragedy. I think that at this point in time, given the enormous priorities, and the Senator quite properly said, you do not have unlimited choices now. You have a political world which requires compromise. I think infrastructure, to deal with things that are broken is critically important. I think building new courthouses or new parks can wait until we see the total impact of this COVID tragedy on state and city revenues.
Of course, every $1 billion that we invest in infrastructure returns $6 billion to the economy and creates 55,000 jobs. So it's been proven as a very efficient, effective stimulus. Natalie, let's go back to questions.
Sure. So our next question comes from Ms. Judith Miller. Ms. Miller, if you would just unmute yourself, please, you are free to ask a question.
Judith, of course, is a commentator, senator, and Dick, as you know, on Fox News, and writes a very insightful blog. Judith, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for doing this, Steve, and thank you, Senator and Dick, for your participation. This is really invaluable. I have a question for each of you gentlemen. Dick, yesterday, and forgive me if I had to walk away for just a couple of minutes for an emergency down here, but you talked about indemnification. Indemnification can too often become a kind of, a signal for a lack of control and interest in how money is being spent. Could you comment on Governor Cuomo's nursing home indemnification clause that was the subject of controversy today in the New York Times, and the balance between protecting industries and making sure that money is not misspent? And Senator Cassidy, you said delay is good because it gives us a chance to work out potential problems in the bill. As you move closer to the election, how does election politics play into the prospects for this legislation? Thank you very much, Steve, for arranging this.
Thank you, Judith. Dick?
Judy, I'm sorry to say that I haven't yet had an opportunity to read the paper this morning, and I'm not sufficiently familiar with the nursing home issue to comment highly intelligently on it. I do think, however, that some form of indemnification for people that have not violated laws per se is a useful thing to avoid the kind of litigation that is not constructive at a time such as what we're going through in this society at this point. So I'm just trying to protect employers against unnecessary frivolous litigation where they did not intentionally do something that harmed somebody else.
Senator?
Yeah, the election politics. That's why I say it's gestating. That child is growing in that womb. I'm getting these feeds as I'm talking to y'all. On my iPad, it all pops up. It's announced that cities will be losing $360 billion. So one of my fellow senators who might otherwise oppose say she is hearing from all these small town Republican mayors that they're getting hammered and that they need support. Well, if you're up for re-election, you're scratching your chin thinking Republican mayors, small towns, kind of a Republican base. Whoa. Similarly, New Orleans is seeking to borrow $100 billion. Now, of course, the subtext is if they cannot, they're going to have to raise taxes and or lay off police officers, firefighters, and sanitation workers. So I think and then the other subtext are all these headlines, market falling, et cetera. So when I say gestating, I think that there's going to be a continued reality that if we don't support government services that are needed to keep employers in business, there is going to be economic fallout. That economic fallout will seek an answer in the political process. We cannot do nothing. We don't just do something to do it. We do that which is wise and measured. But if it is wise and measured, and you can borrow money at basically 0% interest rate, but otherwise your economy collapses, It is gestating, Judith. And I think election politics are a large part of allowing that child to continue to grow.
Thank you, Senator. Natalie, next question, please. We have about 10 minutes left.
Great. So our next question comes from Mayor Ed Adler. If you can unmute yourself, please, you will be free to ask your question.
Hi, thank you very much. And as always, thank you to all of you who are participating on these calls. Steve, these are great and they really make a big difference for all of us. My question is very specific to the legislation that's planned, because our concern at the local level, that is local village mayors, of which there are quite a number on the North Shore of Long Island. Many of our villages, like Sands Point, provide all of the, or most of the essential services. We have our own police force. We share in the cost of the fire department. We have our own water department, and we have our own recreational facilities. All of those are costs to our taxpayers directly. And the concern is that if the legislation isn't written correctly, that a county and state funds will not filter down to our level where it's needed. And that's my concern and question.
There is no minimum, Mayor, for a town or a county to seek some of these funds. And within each state, there will be a portion which bypasses the governor's office and goes straight to those counties and towns.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
That's a good answer, right, Mayor?
Good answer.
Mayor, how many residents do you have in the village?
Our residency level is small. I think our official population is about 3,000, but we have a $20 million budget, and we supply substantial portion, as I mentioned, of the essential services that go directly to our residents.
Can you tell us very briefly what you assess the fiscal hit to be from the virus to your budget?
Well, again, it's very hard for us to determine right now. We're less affected by matters such as sales tax because we get very little anyway. But for instance, let me give you one example. We have an $8 million portion of that $20 million that is our recreational facility, the Village Club of Sands Point. We are just beginning to open facilities, and we're expecting as much of a hit as $1 million because of the fact that the normal user fees are not being paid by residents and people outside the village who are also members of the club. And therefore, with the bonds that paid for the club and so forth, backed by the general fund of the village, if we have a shortfall of $1 million, that will have a very direct taxpayer impact.
Thank you, Mayor. Appreciate it. Natalie, we have time for just
Can I mention one more thing, Steve?
Sure, of course.
Mayor, I don't know exactly where your village is situated, but we do have a provision for those communities which have a seasonal increase in income. So their tax base is not in of itself that big, but you know, it's the summer town where everybody goes. We also try and take in a provision for that. We were very cognizant of small towns and of counties when coming up with this mechanism of distribution. So anyway.
Thank you, Senator. Natalie, next question, please.
Sure. So our next question comes from Michael Rebel. Michael, if you could just go ahead and unmute your microphone, you should be able to ask your question.
You with us, Michael? Michael, you have to unmute your phone, please. All right, Natalie, why don't we go to the next question and maybe you can help Michael unmute his phone.
Sure. So our next question would come from Jonathan Gelman. Jonathan, if you could go ahead and unmute your mic, you can ask your question, please.
Hi. As part of the aid package, I wonder if there might be a temporary, let's say 2 to 3 years, lifting of the $10,000 cap on state and local tax deductions. And, you know, I'm sure there are ways of costing of figuring out what the cost of that would be. And I think it's another source of very well-needed revenue.
Yeah, I would have to, I think that is in the House bill. Obviously, you would want to, you have to do an analysis on that. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. The mayor, the president has spoken of, for example, restoring the deduction for business lunches as a way to stimulate in the short term dollars flowing to the restaurant tours. They're getting hammered. So there are those sorts of short-term things. I saw somebody in the Q&A was asking, that's online, ask whether or not you want to increase charitable deductions for giving to the food banks. So I think that that is all considered. Politically, though, just being honest with you, I think addressing the SALT provisions will be politically problematic. And I'm not saying that to anything, but just to give you the political lay of the land.
Appreciate that, Senator. Natalie, let's go to the next question, please. I think we have time for about 2 or 3 more, max.
So Michael, do you want to try again? Michael is our last question.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now. Thank you. This is Michael Rebell. I run an institute at Columbia University that focuses on education finance matters. So I've got a comment and then a question. The comment is I'm responding to the senator's indications that this situation will gestate and maybe come to a head sometime during the summer. I just wanted to bring to your attention, Senator, that school systems are already starting to lay off teachers for the fall, cut back programs. I think every week that goes by with these dire forecasts of billions of dollars, certainly in New York, in cutbacks in education funding, are going to be a disaster. And if it comes late in the summer, we almost may have a situation where we can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again. So I'm just making a plea that from the education point of view, summer is really late. The second question I have is on maintenance of effort requirements. We've got a concern that if there's full discretion in governors, let me put it this way, education may not get its fair share. I don't know what the various pressures on governors are going to be on how to spend money if it's for general revenue losses, but I'm interested in dealing with these kids who have just been really, I would say most of our most vulnerable kids have already lost the semester. The remote learning just is not an adequate substitute. We don't know what it's going to be in the fall, but if there's not adequate revenue, it's going to be a lot worse than it could be.
Thank you, Michael. Let's let the senator respond.
Michael, you got a lot in that set of questions, man. So I'm going to hit them and maybe go some places where you just tipped your hand out, but I can't help but go. When I say gestate, I mean gestate politically. Believe me, it is hitting the communities right now. It is hitting the communities right now. And so, but it has to get translated into the political. And as the pain squeezes back home, I think it reverberates in Washington. For whatever reason, I think I'm already feeling those reverberations. I am more sensitive to that. As regards public higher education and public education in general, obviously, if the SMART Act passes, the states will have the dollars that they could fund. They could fund the public institutions, potentially private, but certainly the public institutions. So there would, now granted your point, there would have to be a maintenance of effort. At some point in the federal system, you got to rely upon the states to do the right thing. Now, believe me, I've learned more about New York politics than I ever thought I would know. I thought Louisiana's politics were a little dicey, but we're nothing like compared to your precinct. So I get your concern. You're not the first New Yorker I've heard that concern from, but I think there's a limit to how much in federal legislation you can dictate what a state does. You also mentioned something else about the most vulnerable, and I'm thinking right now, how do we get children back in school knowing that a fifth a 5-year-old who misses school, that is a tremendous opportunity cost that will never be recovered because their brain is forming at 5 years old in a way which will already be formed by the time they are 6. So staying closed for 18 months is not an option. There's a report that came out of today from on JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association Pediatrics, out of that just kind of enumerates the impact upon children for this economic lockdown. There's another report that came out yesterday from Iceland that children may be very unlikely to spread the coronavirus. And so maybe the shutting down of schools is not a tool which is aiding in decreasing spread, but which is negatively impacting their developmental outcome. I think, and one thing I'm working on here in Louisiana, there needs to be more than test. There has to be a testing strategy. Testing a hermit living underneath a hood in the middle of the Arizona desert, who cares?